Hey, welcome back, everyone. Mark Thomas here. Are you struggling with the supply and demand in your organization? If I asked 100 IT leaders if they needed additional resources, I could guarantee you none of them would say, no thanks, we're good on resources. I see it all the time. If I added 10 full-time equivalents to your budget today, would you most likely need another 10 shortly after and another 10 after that? Hopefully this isn't you, but likely it could be. Because you see, the problem is not necessarily your lack or perceived lack of resources, but lack of governance over your supply and demand processes. This pretty much sets up the course. Hey, Mark, we have an IT governance problem. We're having issues balancing the work coming into IT with our resource availability. What should we do? Folks, this happens on almost every project that I work on, and what I find is this. It's about how you manage your pipeline. Does this look like yours? Of course, you have new work coming in, and the business is complaining because you are the bottleneck, and then, of course, you have projects or completed projects coming out the other side. This is a classic case of what I call poor IT governance from a business perspective. Our learning objectives for today are to, number one, recognize the key elements of the demand supply pipeline. I think you'll like this. It's very simple, very easy to understand, but hard to do. We'll identify key governance tasks to evaluating, directing, and controlling that demand supply pipeline we just talked about. And then finally, we'll create a methodology to adopt a governance system over this demand and supply pipeline. Because remember, we're talking about governance systems here, so therefore our agenda. Now, speaking of governance and management, let's talk about a few pain points, and you probably won't be surprised to see any of these. Now, we talked about the balance of demand and supply as being a critical success factor, especially when we're talking about governance. This is a direct quote that I pulled from a client email that was asking me to put a governance system in place. And what they were talking about was demand and supply. Some of the key things they were dealing with. They are asking IT to prioritize their requests. And that's where we have the issue, because everything is a top priority. So therefore, a governance strategy. Remember, we talked a few slides ago about governance providing the direction and control. It can help us reduce over-allocating. Now, how do we break this thing down? This is the core of what I wanted to talk to you about today. There are basically 4 different components, or what I might consider phases, to the supply and demand pipeline. You've got your demand, your supply, your execution, and of course, your closure. How do we break this down into some more visibility to help you plan for these? First, let's start with demand. These are the things coming in. This demand may be a specific request, or it might be a demand that might be generated from relationship management or, say, service level management or so on. But what it is doing, it is initiating a request for new work. And so therefore, that new work has to be prioritized. Next, we have our supply side. Once we receive the demand, we have to determine how we're going to deliver this. 2 pieces here, looking at managing our resources and how we estimate that work. Of course, we execute, we deliver, and then we close on that work. Now, when we take a look at this overall cycle, what I wanted to do is focus just on this first part for this course. So let's go back to how we might look at managing or governing this demand coming from the organization. You're going to love this next piece. You've probably sat at a steering committee or a management committee like this, where you're the IT representative, and this is the conversation that's about to take place. Number one, you have a business executive saying, hey, Mark, this is a very important project. I need to get IT involved in this project, and it needs to be completed in the next 2 months, so we're not violating our compliance. Well, you respond back, hey, well, you're saying this is a top priority, correct? The executive responds back, absolutely, it is a top priority. Your response then is, well, then if it's your top priority, projects A and D will have to be postponed for 2 months. Wait a second, from the executive. Nope, that is not possible. Well, okay. Well, these incident tickets we're working on, they'll just have to wait. Oh, no, it's very important. Those are fixed. So you can't do that one either. Okay, got it. Well, then we'll put release X in with only half of the functionality you asked for. The executive response, definitely not an option. We need that release to stay competitive. You, IT, need to figure out a way to make this happen. So this is probably you. The business is asking you to prioritize. Nobody in the organization is governing all of these intake mechanisms, and you're getting pounded from multiple directions without a single governing process to have a single view of all these work requests coming in so that you can balance those against your supply. So what are some of my recommendations here? Along the lines of managing our intake mechanisms is prioritization. Here you see a sample priority coding system. What I suggest to you is to get your business involved in prioritizing these efforts coming in, because remember, that is key here. So remember, we talked about our overall cycle of demand, supply, execution, and closure. This module deals specifically with resource management and work estimation. Let's go back to our model. You might remember we talked about the customer need or demand and all of the different avenues of demand coming into the organization. Now we're dealing with our ability to support that. Do we have the capacity and availability to do that? Well, first we look at resource management. Here's what I would do from a resource management perspective, folks. Okay, let's talk methodologies. What is a methodology anyway? Methodology is a set of best practice steps that we can use to accomplish some objective for the organization. And that's what we're trying to do to create the governance capability around our demand and supply pipeline. So if you take a look at these 5 key steps here, I think it's an important amount of time. So I'm going to try to boil this down into what I consider my top tricks and tips for you. Number 1, remember, you cannot manage the process if it is not governed. Remember, we talked earlier about this distinction between governance and management. What's that distinction? Governance evaluates, directs, and monitors. Management will plan, build, and run based on governing guidance. If you have weak governance, your management will not be able to control this process. Guaranteed. Next, organize that pipeline we talked about into demand, supply, execution, and closure. This course was broken up into demand and supply. We didn't talk as much about execution and closure because that's really more on the project and program management side. Our current issue is how we're managing that relationship between demand and supply. That gives you a great way to organize this. Next, reduce the number of demand entry points. Remember that slide where we had all those boxes of things coming into the organization? So let's go back and make sure we covered our objectives. 1, we said we were going to recognize the key elements of the demand supply pipeline. We covered that. We said we have demand and supply, then we moved to execution and closure. But we wanted to really look at what those key governance tasks were to evaluating, directing, and controlling that demand supply pipeline. I gave you some of my best practices. I also referred you to a few other frameworks that might have some additional information for you. And then finally, we came up with our methodology to how we might put this system in place over time and using a continual improvement approach. Ladies and gentlemen, thanks for joining me in this course. If there's any